Christmas Eve, 2002. A pregnant woman vanishes from a quiet California neighborhood. She is 8 months along. Her son already has a name. At the center was Laci Peterson. She was warm and well-liked, 8 months pregnant with a son they had named Conner. Nothing about the surface suggested how quickly it would collapse. Scott Peterson fit the picture too. A husband waiting for fatherhood. But when investigators later looked back at those final days, they were not looking at chaos. They were looking at a life that gave no sign. Then came Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2002. Scott left the house around 8:30 a.m. He told Laci he was going fishing. Not locally, but 90 minutes away at the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay. He loaded his boat onto his truck and drove west. Laci stayed home. She had the day off. She planned to bake cookies and wrap last-minute gifts. At approximately 9:30 a.m., a neighbor saw Laci walking her golden retriever, Mackenzie, near the house. That was the last confirmed sighting of Laci Peterson alive. The neighbor noticed nothing strange. Then nothing. No calls. No texts. No further sightings. For the next 7.5 hours, Laci Peterson simply disappeared from the record. Scott returned home around 5 p.m. He later said he found the front door unlocked. The dog was in the backyard without its leash. Laci was gone. He called a family friend first, then his mother-in-law, then finally police. Officers arrived just before 6 p.m. They searched the house, the backyard, the neighborhood. No sign of struggle. No note. No Laci. No forced entry. No witnesses. No explanation. In any disappearance, hope initially feels logical. One phone call, one sighting could return ordinary life. But time moved forward, and that hope thinned out. Laci was 8 months pregnant. The clock was closing in. This was not just a woman missing from a California neighborhood. This was a nearly full-term mother standing at the edge of a new life, and then suddenly stepping out of it. Her son already had a name. Conner. That detail gave the story an intimacy strangers could not shake. As the search widened, the story spread beyond Modesto. A pregnant woman missing at Christmas. A family trying to hold itself together. And a husband standing before cameras while uncertainty grew heavier each day. Grief was no longer private. Confusion was no longer private. Scott Peterson was not just living through the case anymore. He was being watched from inside it. The camera does more than record. It turns silence into suspicion. A husband first appears as part of the tragedy. Then slowly, he begins to look like part of the mystery. Then investigators discovered that Scott Peterson had been having an affair. The woman was Amber Fry. Once that became public, the image at the center of the case fractured instantly. This was no longer just a missing pregnant woman and her pleading husband. Another life ran beneath the surface. Another version of Scott the public had never seen. Affairs do not prove murder. But in a case already thick with fear, they changed everything. The marriage looked different. The public appeals looked different. Even the timeline felt altered by the knowledge that deception had lived inside the life people watched on television. Amber Fry spoke with investigators and became part of the effort to understand who Scott Peterson really was. The more the public learned, the less this felt like a disappearance wrapped in uncertainty. It was starting to feel like something far darker. The perfect suburban frame was gone. In its place stood a marriage under suspicion, a husband under scrutiny, and a country watching every development as if the truth might reveal itself in real time. For months, the central question remained suspended. Was Laci still out there? Then, in April 2003, that question collapsed. Along the shoreline near San Francisco Bay, bodies were discovered. The search was no longer about rescue. It was about confirmation. When remains were identified as Laci Peterson and her unborn son Conner, the emotional center of the case changed forever. This was no longer a disappearance wrapped in mystery. It was now a homicide case. The grief that carried the story became colder and final. The worst possibility people had feared had become reality, hidden beneath distance, water, and time. Only days after the bodies were found, Scott Peterson was arrested. The arrest felt less like a sudden twist than the closing of a circle that had been tightening since Christmas Eve. The country had not simply followed the case. It had lived inside it. Now the story would move to a courtroom. Prosecutors focused on the life Scott had kept hidden. Amber Fry became central evidence. Jurors heard recorded calls. In one, Scott said he was in Paris while Laci was missing. The defense argued a random abduction, but the prosecution returned to the same questions. Why was Scott at the bay where bodies appeared? Why did he buy concrete anchors? In November 2004, the verdict came. Guilty. Scott Peterson was convicted of murdering Laci and their unborn son. The death sentence later became life without parole. The Peterson case never faded, not because it was loud, but because it felt disturbingly close to ordinary life. A home, a marriage, a child who never had a chance to be born. Laci and Conner never came home. That is the irreversible truth.